Good morning. Comrade Stalin has entered into a pact with the Germans, and we will both attack. What the hell? Okay, so me attempting to do a Russian accent somehow turned really weird and never sounded Russian. So I'm not going to continue with that, folks. Hello, it's the historical gamer yet again. And that awkward intro aside, today I'm going to be returning to Soviet Corps, the newest addition to the Panzer Corps series, which looks at the Soviet Union during World War II, fighting against not only the Germans, but also against the Poles and against the Finns and against the Japanese. Basically, it covers the conflicts that the Soviet Union fought from 1939 until 1945. And this is the second part in this series, looking at this new expansion that's put out by Matrix and Slytherin Games. And in this particular video, we will actually be looking at the Soviet invasion of Eastern Poland. So, if you remember from our last video, we actually fought the Battle of Kalkin Gol, where the Soviet Union fought against the Japanese in 1939, another one of those border skirmishes. But it was important because while the Soviets had been fighting the Japanese in various border skirmishes from 1932 all the way to 1939, Kalkin Gol represented not exactly a decisive Soviet victory because they actually lost more men, but it represented a turning point where the Japanese were beaten on the battlefield, they were turned back on the battlefield, and they were obviously incapable of defeating the Soviets, which was a big deal because it prompted a peace treaty with the Japanese, a ceasefire with the Japanese, and allowed the Soviets to really focus west. It also dissuaded the Japanese, when World War II did begin with the Germans, from launching attacks into Siberia because they felt or knew about some of the experiences that they had had against the Soviets just a few years earlier, how horribly outclassed their military was. And this was in large part due to lack of tanks, sufficient armored vehicles, and modern doctrine. The Japanese were still really fighting a World War I type army, when the Soviets, while the actual experience and quality of many of their men were not yet ready to fight Germany, they were certainly ready to fight Japan in 1939. So that battle had an important effect in that it allowed Russia to secure its eastern border, and its treaty would end up leading to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Now that Russia was no longer worried about their eastern border after the ceasefire with Japan, Russia began concentrating to the west. And as a result, largely, of Western nations' unwillingness to stand against the Nazis in Munich when the Germans invaded Czechoslovakia, the Soviets decided, listen, if the Western European nations, and I'll go back real quick, basically in 1938, I want to say, I could be wrong on that, the Germans invaded Czechoslovakia, or threatened to invade. And they basically said, you have to give us this chunk of Czechoslovakia because there's a lot of Germans here. We need to protect Germans who are being abused by the Czech government. This was after a couple of years prior, the Germans had invaded and taken over Austria as well. So Germany invades and takes over Austria, and then they start making threats on Czechoslovakia, who has defensive treaties with the Western Allies. And as a result of German threats, the Western Allies agree, okay, listen, we'll go ahead and we'll agree to your terms. You can have this chunk of Czechoslovakia in exchange for you agreeing to a peace treaty with us and agreeing not to go to war anytime soon. So that was the agreement that they came up with. Well, just a short while later, Germany invaded and took over the rest of Czechoslovakia, which was now largely defenseless to do much about it because their best defensive terrain also was the terrain that had been handed over to the Germans. So now you have a situation where the Germans are obviously aggressors in Europe, and in the Soviet mind, the Soviets had stood up during sort of this time period and said, listen, we need to stop Germany now before they become too powerful. But the Western Allies really didn't want to do anything about it. And when I say the Western Allies, what I mean is France and Britain, who would become the Western Allies. So as a result of the unwillingness, or seemingly unwillingness, of the Western Allies to do anything about Germany, the Soviets decide, listen, we've got to take matters into our own hands and protect the Soviet Union, protect the motherland against the threat that is Germany, and they begin to negotiate some agreements with the Germans. And the culmination of that is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, shortly before the German invasion of Poland, which occurred on September 10th, 1939. The Germans and the Soviets agreed to sign a non-aggression pact. And that non-aggression pact basically assures that Germany will not have to deal with a two-front war, which was their biggest concern. If you look back at World War I, Germany had a very negative experience with being stuck in a two-front war, and as a result, they were desperate if a war was going to erupt. Keep in mind that the Germans didn't think there was going to be a war at that point, but they were still worried that if a war did erupt, they would be stuck in a two-front war again, which was a large part of their defeat in World War I. The fact that Germany had to split their resources between fighting France and Britain in the west and fighting the Russians in the east was a huge drain on resources, and if the Germans had been able to focus on one front, in 1916 even, just one front, if they'd been able to narrow the war down to one front, it's very possible that the Germans could have won the war in World War I. So Germany was terrified again of being stuck in a two-front war. And actually, Germany's war plans in World War I were even designed to try and knock one side out before numbers could play a role, because even in World War I, the Germans were afraid of a two-front war that they ended up getting stuck in. Ironic, the Germans were afraid of a two-front war in World War II, and they took some measures to prevent that, and those measures proved inadequate because of their own stupidity. So the same thing would repeat itself. But, as I was saying, the Germans signed this treaty with Russia, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is a non-aggression pact with the Soviets, and the goal is to avoid a two-front war yet again. What the treaty did was it basically assured that Russia and Germany would not fight each other when Germany invaded Poland shortly thereafter. The Germans and the Russians also signed a secret provision in the treaty which agreed to spheres of influence between the two countries. So basically, if you drew a line through the middle of Poland, Germany would get the western half of Poland, Germany would get most of Romania, and several other countries that would fall under Germany's sphere of influence, where any actions that occurred inside those countries the Russians wouldn't interfere with. Meanwhile, the Russians had a similar sphere of influence. The Russians gained a sphere over Finland, so if Russia invaded Finland, as they would later, the Germans wouldn't intervene. It was also agreed that the Russians would have a sphere of influence over the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which the Soviets would invade in the 1940s as well. And it agreed that the Germans and the Soviets would split Poland, as well as a portion of Romania would be provisioned to the Soviets as well. This became part of Bessarabia. So in 1939, as the Germans are invading, the Soviets are concluding their treaty with the Japanese, which went into effect on September 16th. So 6 days after Germany invades Poland, the Soviet Union invades Poland as well, this time from the east. Obviously, the Polish military was more concerned with the German invasion, so a lot of their attention was focused westward, but they did end up resisting the Soviets as well. So the poor Polish state is caught between Germany and Russia on each side and is crushed. The majority of the fighting that we think of when we think of the war with the Polish is between the Germans and the Polish, but again, the Soviets invaded as well. And there was a famous incident that became famous after the war in Katyn Forest, where some people were rounded up, some Polish military officers or aristocrats, anyone who was basically deemed a potential threat to the Communist Party in Poland, was rounded up and shot in a mass grave. A lot of time we think of the war crimes in World War II being committed mainly by the Germans, to somewhat of a lesser extent by the Japanese, and then there's certainly some debate over sort of the bombing campaigns of the Western Allies, but very rarely do you hear much in the way of war crimes committed by the Russians. When you do, it usually is in that sort of post-war period where the Russians are kind of invading through Germany and slowly overwhelming Germany, and then you start seeing these situations where the Soviets feel like they're taking vengeance on the Germans through various heinous acts like mass rape or executions or other things like that as they begin to take Germany over. But what they don't talk much about is the war crimes that were committed at the beginning of the war, before Germany and Russia were even enemies, when the Soviet Union was invading and taking over Poland and the Latvian states as well. Baltic states as well. So anyway, that sets the stage for the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland. And that's what I'm playing right now, folks. Now that we're 10 minutes in, that's exactly what we're doing. We're invading Poland. It's Panzer Corps, the Soviet Corps expansion, if you will, of the game. And my general tactic, now that I'm almost more than a third of the way into this video, is to kind of have two pincers. We've got one in the north, we've got one in the south. And the main goal is to try and, just basically advance directly westward, take these objective cities of ours, and go from there. And actually, sorry, I'm a little bit behind on this. Actually, the goal originally was going to be to have two separate pincers, but actually in this case I've decided to focus all of my efforts in the north, with a token force kind of just keeping an eye on the Polish in the south. So the main goal is to take these two cities in the north that are Polish objectives. We've actually already taken one of them, and then turn south and deal with the objectives in the south. Now, there's a German armored car, which is a recon unit that's also been dispatched to play a supporting role for us. But really my objective here is to take these cities in the north. Now, a key whenever you attack, there's a couple of things, and I kind of talked about it in the last video, I believe, but a key in attacking in Panzer Corps is the way you use artillery. So if artillery is adjacent to the unit you're attacking and it's behind them and it has ammunition, it will fire in support, assuming it's not suppressed itself, which will make your attack much more costly and much more difficult. Now, when we look at the numbers here, the numbers on the map here, one thing you'll generally want to keep in mind is the color that the number is. So when you see a unit like that is kind of an orange, if you will, color, what that means is that unit is fully suppressed, which typically, although I've seen a few exceptions where that's not the case, typically that means if you attack it, it will not shoot back. Now, units around it that are not suppressed could fire in support, like those artillery units you've seen, but units that are actually suppressed with that kind of orangish color will will not shoot back at you when you attack them. So it makes it much easier to defeat. Units that kind of have a gold or yellowish color on their number mean that they're partially suppressed, so they will fire back, but they'll fire back with less effect. And units that are white numbered indicate no suppression at all, and they will resist you fully at maximum capabilities. So just something to keep in mind there as you see me kind of stumble around playing here. Now, I do want to preface that I am not an expert at this game. I am not someone who's a ace player or anything like that. So please don't think that. My talent at the game is limited. I haven't played it a ton. I've got like 12 hours, I think, of all the Panzer Corps series on my Steam account name. I played more before it was on Steam, but I haven't played recently, so I'm certainly not going to be the kind of Let's Player who's going to say, here's all the ins and outs and secrets of the game and how you beat it and all of that. That's just not me. But in the first 10 minutes, I would say we more or less adequately covered the history of the Soviet invasion. So we kind of talked about why the Soviets, not necessarily why, I guess, so we can go back to that. So we talked about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and how it kind of divided Eastern Europe into two spheres, one under Germany and one under the Soviet Union. And this is, if you know much about the history of the era, this is kind of an odd situation. These are odd bedfellows. You wouldn't think of the Soviet Union and the Germans as the most likely to come together. We had already mentioned that when Germany was going after Czechoslovakia, that the Soviets were very outspoken in their opposition to the Germans, and that they were one of the few nations who was willing to provide troops to resist the Germans. And this is because communism and fascism are very much diametrically opposed. Communism is kind of the extreme party on the far left of the political spectrum, and fascism tends to be linked with the far right. So you've got the ultra-conservative on the right, which is, I don't know if that's terribly accurate, because I think when people think conservatives today, they think, at least ideologically speaking, small government, personal liberties. Obviously, the fascists were not into personal liberties or small government, but they were certainly the opposite of communists. They didn't believe in kind of the people's revolution either. Not that the Soviet Union really did, but we don't need to get into a philosophical debate about what the Soviet Union really was or wasn't, or what communism really is or means or anything like that. Essentially, fascism and communism don't play nice together. They're two ideologies that historically have been opposed to each other, and that was certainly the case in the run-up to World War II. In fact, when the Nazis were coming to power in 1933, their main political rival wasn't any other party in Germany, it was actually the Communists. If you're looking to learn more about World War II Germany, I think it's worth looking at Weimar Germany as well, the period where Germany had a democratic government between World War I's end and 1933 when the Nazis took over in Germany. I think it's an interesting period to look at. There's a lot of cultural reasons why Germany had sort of a flourishing of art. There's a sort of an art or cultural style that's kind of thought to be part of Weimar Germany, and it's an interesting time period to look into. But during this time period, as Germany is really struggling economically throughout the Great Recession, which hit Europe just as hard as it hit the United States, during this time period, as Germany is really suffering, they're under the weight of these reparations that had been demanded by the victorious powers in World War I. Germany has this massive and crippling debt that they have to pay back, and they begin inflating their currency, and then European nations stop accepting German Deutschmarks because the currency has basically no value, and in some cases it's cheaper for people to heat their houses by burning money than it is to buy wood because the wood is so expensive and the money is so worthless. It's a crazy period, but during this period of time, Germans begin to feel like, well, this experiment with democracy isn't working. What do we do? And they start to look to the extremes. So you kind of have two extremes pop up in Germany. The communists had a history in Germany where they were actually in existence toward the end of World War I. There was a socialist revolution in the German Navy and some other uprisings in Germany as well toward the end of World War I. And that was one thing that also prompted Germany into sort of a peace treaty, is they were terrified of this sort of Marxist revolution perhaps coming to Germany. So that was another thing that kind of caused the German general staff to be like, all right, listen, World War I's not going great, but we need to end this war now, because they're essentially aristocrats. They're invested in maintaining the status quo in terms of society. So a lot of them felt like, listen, okay, democracy, great, not perfect. Losing the Kaiser, not really great. They didn't really bargain for any of that, but there was a certain sense of relief of, what, at least it's not the communists. At least the communists are not in power, because there was this tremendous fear throughout Germany of that. And as you go into Weimar Germany after World War I, and as the economy in Germany goes into the shitter really, and you start to see these extremist parties start coming to power, you see the communists gaining a substantial amount of power in Germany. It's not just the Nazis, it's not just the nationalist rhetoric of the Nazis, but there is also a large degree of communist sentiment that's rising up in Germany. And there are street clashes between the fascists and between the communists. And one of the first things that the Germans do when the Nazis take power in Germany, one of the first things that they do is they launch serious campaigns against what was left of the Communist Party in Germany. So the Germans had a history of battling between the far right and the far left in violent fashion in Germany. And again, the Soviets are the only ones after Munich, the treaty that the British negotiate to give up Czechoslovakia basically to the Germans. The Soviets are the only ones willing to step up and provide military forces against the Germans. And again, that's because communism and fascism had been fighting for so long. And I'm sorry, the quality here is a little bit bad. I'm using OBS. A lot of times I use a different video capture software. If it looks kind of hazy and bad to you, I'm not sure how it'll render out, but this is a little bit frustrating. So I hope the audio is not too bad. But as the communists kind of realize, listen, the West doesn't have any appetite for conflict. They don't even seem to care what happens to the rest of Europe as long as they're kept out of a war. We've got to go ahead and sign this peace treaty, which I've kind of already talked about. So that's the situation in 1939. Germany's invading Poland, and a week into the invasion, the Soviet Union's opportunistically invade from the east. It's not all that unlike in 1940 when Germany's invading France, when Italy finally decides to go to war on the side of the Germans. The Italians actually stayed out of the war when Poland happened, and they stayed out of the war when Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. But when Germany invaded France, then by that point the Italians were kind of looking and saying, okay, let's wait and see how this war plays out. Let's wait and see who's going to be the victor. And that's when Mussolini, after the French invasion was going so swimmingly for the Germans, it was like, okay, the Nazis have overrun Poland, they've overrun Denmark, they've overrun Norway, Belgium, Holland, and now they're crushing France. All right, they're going to be the victorious power. Let's get in on some of this success. So they opportunistically invade from Italy into the south of France, only to have their conquests invalidated when Vichy France is allowed to be independent, sort of, kind of, not really. And the Germans take over direct occupation of kind of northern and eastern France, and Italy really gets nothing. But that's neither here nor there. The main point of that is that it's kind of a similar situation where the Soviets are opportunistically invading into Poland. But a key reason for that invasion is building a buffer. The Soviets might have a non-aggression pact with the Germans, but as this mission briefing points out, that doesn't mean that they're friends. They don't view the Germans as friendly. They don't view them as trustworthy. The Soviets were caught off guard by the German invasion in 1941. That's certainly true. But they envisioned a war against the Germans eventually. They didn't believe that fascism and communism could coexist. The Germans didn't believe it either. And both sides really thought there was going to be a big struggle between communism and fascism eventually. The Soviets just didn't think it would happen as early as 1941. And they weren't really ready yet, because in the 1930s, the Soviet military had undergone a series of dramatic and devastating purges that were issued on the order of Joseph Stalin, the leader of Russia at the time, basically removing anyone who he thought could possibly in any way, even just a little bit, be a threat to him. Unfortunately for the Soviet Union, that meant that anyone with any real experience or any real ability in the military was more or less rounded up and shot, starved, or just removed from the military. So when they do start getting involved in these conflicts, they're fighting the Japanese in 39, they're fighting the Poles in 39, they're fighting the Finns in 39. They start getting involved in these conflicts with basically an entirely green army that has no experience whatsoever, no officers whatsoever that have seen combat or know what the heck they're doing, and they're almost all political appointees. You start seeing things go poorly. It wasn't as dramatic in the invasion of Poland, however, so I think we'll talk more about sort of the struggles of the post-purge Soviet army in the next video, which will look at the attack on Finland. But basically, that's the situation when the Soviet Union invades Poland. And again, it's not really represented in the game, but later they'll invade the Baltic states. And a lot of it ties back to the Soviets feeling that eventually there is going to be a war with the Germans. I'm saying this in a really long-winded way, so I apologize for that. But there is certainly a sense within the Soviet Union that war is going to come with Germany. And so invading Poland and the Baltic states makes sense. It makes sense because it gives you a buffer. So if Germany invades Poland, then they're right flat up against the border with Russia. Additionally, if Romania falls to Germany's sphere of influence, they've got that additional buffer. Or not buffer, but that additional border that they have to cover. So Germany could theoretically, if they run roughshod over Eastern Europe, they could have a massive border with the Soviet Union that would make defending the Soviet Union really difficult, and the Germans would be much closer to Moscow. As a result, when Germany invades Poland and Russia, finishes off their non-aggression pact with the Japanese, and they have this non-aggression pact with the Germans, the idea is like, okay, well, let's go ahead and let's invade Eastern Poland. And not only does it give you the advantage of extra territory and personnel and resources and whatnot to draw on, not only does it give your army that's been devastated by coup a chance to get some military experience, but another additional benefit to this attack by the Soviets is it creates a buffer. They add several hundred miles between the border that they now have with the Germans in Poland and their capital in Moscow and their key city in Leningrad. And I'm sorry, guys, if you hear me yawning or anything like that. I'm trying to keep that out, trying to edit that out, but it is about 3 a.m. here as I'm recording this, so be that as it may, I may have some yawning in here. Hope not, but may do that. So that's the situation when the Soviet Union invades Poland. That's the reasoning behind the invasion, is to build a buffer, to extend Soviet influence west. There's also sort of this concept of a global Soviet revolution, a worldwide revolution of communism that plays at least some lip service in the time period. So there's several factors that are playing a role as the Soviets invade, but nonetheless they strike into their exposed rear of the Polish forces, and the Poles really don't have much of a chance. They're caught between the German World War II juggernaut on the west and the Soviet steamroller in the east. So that's the situation when the Soviet Union invades Poland, and they invade on September 17th, 1939, 7 days after the Germans invade Poland in the West. So World War II in Europe starts on September 10th, 1939. The Soviet Union's come in on the side of the Germans on September 17th in 1939. And they kind of try and portray it, I believe, as well to some extent, like they're liberating Eastern Poland, or they're coming in and providing protection to Eastern Poland against the German invasion. But make no mistake about it, it was a Soviet conquest of Eastern Poland. And I'm sorry, I actually misspoke throughout this video and the last video. The German invasion of Poland started on September 1st. By September 17th, the conflict had been going on for 16 days, and the German army had actually stalled to some extent for lack of fuel and stubborn Polish resistance. Now, I've seen some historians try and argue that Poland would have been able to withstand the Germans for a long time if the Soviets hadn't invaded in the east and basically attacked the Polish in the rear when they weren't looking. I don't know if I really buy that, but I do find it interesting that the Germans had at least temporarily stalled. I think it was similar, however, to, if you look at the 2003 invasion of the U.S., without getting political, invasion of the U.S. Of Iraq, that is, the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. There was a period shortly after the conflict began, I think the U.S. forces were around Nasirah, where they kind of stalled for a bit. I want to say it was like a week or at least a few days where things kind of stopped progressing, and it was more so just a lack of fuel and the need for the logistical supply chain to catch up with U.S. forces before the eventual final drive on Baghdad than it was any sort of actual U.S. stall. Now, Poland was still far more superior than Iraq was during 2003 against the U.S., relatively speaking, but I don't buy the assertions that Poland would have been able to resist for a substantially long period of time. The Western Allies had numerous supplies and transports en route, but German subs would have been able to really play havoc on that. Any supplies would have had to have gone through the Black Sea and then into Romania and then across Romania into Poland. It certainly was not an ideal situation to be in. But nonetheless, whether they would have resisted a long time or not, the intervention of the Soviet Union into Poland was decisive in determining the victory for Germany in Western Poland. Furthermore, it's interesting to say that the Western Allies didn't do much about it. They went to war with Germany over their invasion of Poland, but they didn't do much with regards to the Soviet Union, and that was because they didn't want a war with the Soviet Union. The idea of fighting the Germans and the Russians at the same time was horrific, and despite the assurances of the treaty that the Allies had with Poland, it was really designed to protect and defend against Germany. It was not designed to defend against the Soviet Union. The Western Allies were in no position to fight the Soviets. They already had their hands full enough with the Germans, and I suppose maybe it was even perceived that despite the conflict against the Poles, the Germans and the Soviets really weren't all that close. They weren't really something that they needed to be you needed to be afraid of. And frankly, it would have been a horrible political decision to go to war with the Soviet Union and drive them into bed and alliance with the Germans. So it was an incredibly complicated situation when the Soviets intervened in middle of September. But within 20 days of the Soviet invasion of Western Poland, Poland had completely collapsed. The German resistance had advanced and taken Warsaw by then. The eastern half of Poland was occupied by the Soviets. The Soviets took almost 100,000 casualties and inflicted a further 27,000 killed, wounded, or missing. So almost 20,000 or almost 100,000 prisoners, with a further 27,000 killed, wounded, or missing inflicted on the Polish military. And they basically broke the back of the Polish forces. The Germans did the bulk of the actual fighting and dying and killing. I want to say less than 1,000 Soviets were actually killed, but nonetheless, it was a big impact when more than 500,000 Soviets invade eastern Poland. Anyway, guys, that's all I've got for you as far as the history. The gameplay at this moment is pretty self-explanatory. Use artillery, soften up your opponent. armor versus armor is fairly effective on the offensive. Armor can be very difficult when you're trying to attack infantry with armor. The infantry can fare pretty well. But guys, I think that's probably about all the time I have for you here. This is going to be the end of this particular scenario. It's going to be a victory, but we didn't take that bunker in the southern half of the map, so it won't be a triumph, which a triumph was like a major victory, and a victory is just a regular victory. So we did win a victory. We did defeat the Poles, and our next conflict will be against the Finns, most likely, in the Winter War, which we'll be able to talk about. Maybe I'll talk a little bit more about the game, but I'll also talk more about the history as well during the Winter War scenario, which is the next one. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what your thoughts are. And until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.